About today, here with us today, we have Norm Van Eden Petersman, who is Director of Movement Building for the Strong Towns Movement. Strong Towns is a national nonprofit that has been really influential in changing the conversation around what makes communities strong and resilient. They support many wonderful things that we as planners in this room and advocates support, like incremental upzoning, creating denser, more vibrant downtowns, making cities more financially resilient, safe streets, ending parking minimums, all these really wonderful things that contribute to creating strong, vibrant communities. And Norm here is here today to tell us about the new Strong Towns book, Escaping the Housing Trap, as well as a bit about how Strong Towns has been so effective in getting their message across the country in areas both conservative and very progressive and being equally effective in all contexts. So with that, thank you, Norm, for coming, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, and good morning or afternoon, almost afternoon, I suppose, for folks that are on the East Coast. So it is great to be with you, and I'm excited to be able to share about the work that we all need to be doing in order to address the fact that we're in the midst of what we're classifying, and I'll share a little bit more in the presentation, is right now a trap that we found ourselves in. We are in the midst of a massive crunch and really struggling to deal with this. And it's one of those interesting things that as we deal with communities in, small rural areas outside of Wyoming or in Utah or all across the United States, but also in Canada where I am, we're seeing just continued intense pressure on more and more people within our communities who are struggling with housing scarcity. My wife and I just found a new rental in the community that we live in. We pay $500 more a month for a lot less space and a lot more anxiety, and we feel trapped in a situation that really defies the chance to be able to improve our conditions. And it's in this type of situation that there are so many people that are struggling in this context. And so just to briefly introduce you to Strong Towns and maybe to help shed light on the approach that we have taken to addressing many of the broad issues that affect our communities, our core conviction is that the prevailing pattern of development is making North American cities and towns weak and fragile. And therefore, we seek to change that. And I'll introduce you to the language of the suburban experiment and the way in which many of the standards of the suburban experiment have even been smuggled into our built-up existing cities or large urban areas. And as a result, those standards have defied our ability to be able to generate lasting prosperity in our communities. And this is small towns, large towns, cities of all sizes. This is a core issue that we're facing. And so we're a member-supported nonprofit with a reach now all over the world. We have 5,700 members at present, but we also have over 2,500 people that have said we want to get local conversation groups going in our communities. We have 250 of these already established, and we're training hundreds and hundreds of other people to work at getting groups going, to be able to intercede and participate in the process of shaping local change. Maybe also to share one element of this is that we believe we have to work within the existing institutions, particularly with local governments, in order to bring about the change that we seek. Because the challenge that faces us, and we'll touch on for the next hour, is as you are deeply woven into this question of what do we do to provide housing to people in places where that housing has become scarce, expensive, and hotly contested. And the irony being that in virtually all of our communities, we're facing the reality that housing has become scarce, expensive, and hotly contested. Yes, there are still some areas where disinvestment has resulted in very low property values and limited prospects for being able to recoup your costs when you build a new house. But the reality is, in most of our places, we're facing the fact that it's the opposite. It's a time of strangling exclusion, and so many people are struggling in this context. As Will mentioned, a book with the same name, Escaping the Housing Trap, came out. It was authored by my colleagues, Chuck Marone, as well as Daniel Harrigus. And if you're interested in what we touch on today, this previews a lot of the information that's there, but we definitely want to continue to spark the conversation and particularly, as Will mentioned, to ask those questions? How do we insert these ideas into conversations where it brings people on side rather than always struggling to find that path or that point of connection with people in communities that, for very valid reasons and sometimes invalid reasons, are struggling with the idea that more housing should be built near them, preferring for it to happen elsewhere, or preferring for it not to happen at all. And in these contexts, we're outlining this core challenge that this creates in our communities, that when we lose sight of the building blocks that create lasting prosperity, we begin to enter cycles of decline. And so even as we see high prices, those are actually hallmarks of growing decline in many of our communities. One of the areas that we've seen that decline is in the capacity of local builders who are at the small scale level to be able to iteratively and incrementally work within existing neighborhoods. This has been made very difficult. You can take an existing single family home and tear it down and put up a large home in its place, but to do anything different, to use a skill set to address a broader range of housing needs is often very difficult in most existing neighborhoods. And this is something that we are working to change. The next increment of development, you hear me explain this a little bit more later, needs to be allowed by right in every neighborhood in America. Where I live in British Columbia, a provincial government allowed now up to 4 units on every residential lot, which is a big step forward, a big step from previously allowing exclusive single-family residential zoning to occur. And in that context, one of the interesting things from a Strong Towns perspective is we would say that's good, but what happens a few generations from now when the need is not just for 4 units on that lot, but to continue to allow that adaptation, to continue to allow the next increment of development to emerge? And what happens in our communities when we actually say, let's allow this by right, as the assumption that it will take place in the matter of course, and that as a result of this, we can actually unlock some of those lift and pull factors within our communities to respond rapidly to increase pressures in our communities, rather than having that pressure build up, and build up, and which is the situation that we find ourselves in. Because our current path, this is our core message, that was meant as a means of securing prosperity for all, has unwittingly trapped us in a system that is incapable of building lasting prosperity. And so how do we get out of this? How do we address this? A core element of our message is that local and iterative actions, building a bit by bit, are the best approach to gradually create and sustain local prosperity. Because as a core principle, and this is something that we found really resonates with a growing sort of mass audience, is that no neighborhood should be subject to radical change. That is, if you return to your neighborhood 10 years later that you grew up in, there should still be recognizable elements to it. Because this speaks to a certain human need to have a sense of place, a sense of belonging. And yet, the antidote to radical change is not to have no change, but instead to allow growing, gradual, incremental change. No neighborhood should be exempt from change is another key element of this. And yet we're seeing this being fought vociferously, the idea that entire enclaves should be reserved in their single finished form and left untouched, except for the ravages of time and depreciation and all of those things. And yet in that context, we say no neighborhood should be subject to radical change, but simultaneously, no neighborhood should be exempt from change. And this is often a path to discussion with individuals. So when you say, hey, I'm with you, I don't want to see radical change. Sometimes you have to work on what that definition entails, but then you can say, what does it look like when no change occurs? It only looks like in most of our communities, things becoming more expensive and scarce and difficult and creating challenges that we actually have the means to be able to overcome, and helping people to grapple with that. And the predicament that we find ourselves in is that while we mobilize, we will seemingly be part of a worsening problem, and the housing relief won't immediately materialize. Within the Strong Towns organization, we say the suburban experiment has an 80-year head start on us. And so we need to spot ourselves at least 40 years before we become too discouraged about the state of conditions in the situations that we find ourselves in. That is, this is a long game, and it requires persistent pursuit of the things that we need within our communities. Now, when we talk about a housing trap, I want to do this by way of analogy in the context of an agriculture trap, just to explain this a little bit further. So the agricultural trap, you've all know Noah Harari and others have outlined the shift that occurred in human settlements from the hunter-gatherer pattern of living to an agricultural society. Imagine a smaller population, and it's a hunter-gatherer population, grabbing from the ground and from the land the hides and the food that it requires, and making their way through their communities. And when you do this, you're able to sustain your population, but you're also doing so on the move. You're continuing to go to where food sources are. But imagine there was an individual that identified that if they continue to return to the same berry bush and continue to sort of cultivate that bush, that it began to create more revenue or more resources for them. The fruit of that was that individuals began to say, maybe we can actually stay in a place and develop agriculture. And as you develop that agriculture, your food supply became more predictable, more repeatable. And as a result, you didn't even have to travel all that far for it. And oftentimes there was less danger to harvesting berries than there was to harvesting bison. And so the consequence of this is it could support a much larger population. Now, in order to continue to support a growing population, you needed a much larger supply of food. And in that context, what happens then is you get, and even you have the capacity for an even greater, greater population control. The challenge is this is a one-way street. Once you commit to this path, you cannot go back, or it is extremely difficult to go back. And in the context of the agriculture trap, the consequence of going back to hunter-gatherer societies and practices would actually result in mass die-off among many, many people because of the capacity being so limited in terms of the ability to get the food sources needed in comparison with what's available through agriculture. And this is application to what we see with housing as well. That through policy and subsidies and a flurry of construction, resulting in a dramatically simplified method of building out cities, the suburban experiment, we said we are going to trade the complexity and the adaptability of our traditional settlement patterns of our cities. This is in the era of the around First World War, Second World War, around that time. We've traded all of that complexity, the messiness of it, and in the very modernist spirit that put Buzz Aldrin and Lance Armstrong on the moon, we are going to do something different. We're going to do things that allow for growth and predictability. We're going to turn our cities into machines and our neighborhoods into carbon copies of each other. They're going to have a replicating process that we can harvest. Much like the Model T assembly line, we're going to build out neighborhoods in this way. And as a key part of this, we're going to do so in a way that allows us to predictably know where all the inputs are going, where all the outputs are going, and what the outcome is going to look like. This was very different than the somewhat messy, but much more dynamic, much more complex, much more adaptable form of city building that we see in our communities around us. The cities on the left would be examples of complex adaptations of existing locations, whereas on the right we see housing, but it's in a very complicated. It's a complicated system, but it lacks that adaptability. It lacks the malleability that is necessary in order to make a thriving ecosystem. And we can see this, for example, in the 1870s. This is a historic city photo out of Grand Rapids, Michigan. You can notice the mix of sizes and uses. There's complexity in the way that things are building out. You see full lot coverage in the areas where there's a frontage to the street because of the expectation that that's where prosperity is generated. That's where opportunities emerge from your connection to the street. So you want to be fronting that. You don't want to be set way back unless you were a lord or a manor king that was able to say, oh, I don't need to be by the hoi polloi. But then everybody else would be where the action was. And this was a hallmark of also using land carefully, using resources in a very careful and prescribed way, and doing so in the form of incremental growth and adaptation. You see that lower image there is pointing to this little shed connecting two buildings to each other. And this would have been the natural, normal response to, hey, Uncle Albert just moved in. We don't have a room for him in our house, so we're going to, as rapidly as possible, construct something for him. We're going to do those things that are necessary to adapt to local housing need in a rapid, iterative way, rather than waiting and waiting and waiting, having to beg and genuflect and go before a planning commission to do all of these things. And obviously there were needs around sewer, around health and welfare. There were some elements that I think over time our cities began to refine. But much of that reaction resulted in very rigorous sort of machine-like systems to process every level of change, with the result that it deadened many of our communities and made them difficult to work in. Out of this, one of the things that began to happen is that in the 1930s, you have the Great Depression, you have the great challenge that many people are faced with, the fact they cannot afford to be in the homes that they're in or on the farms that they're in. And in this context, one of the things that was happening was that many of the homes that people were in were now no longer worth what they needed to be in order for them to continue to make payments on their loans, in order for them to have, even with limited means, to be able to cover their costs and for the banks to continue to hold these properties. Out of this, it began a spiral where, as houses would come onto the market, it would drop the prices for everything else around it, resulting in a run or a decline where anyone who had the capacity to buy something would simply wait a week because prices would be lower. In this context, one of the things that the federal government recognized is that they needed to backstop the price of a home in order to prevent it from further sliding, preventing it from losing all of its value. And so out of this, you saw the federal government step in the 1930s to backstop federal mortgages, to take the risk from the banks, to take the obligation from the banks to backstop the loans that they had made, and instead shift the responsibility to the federal government. And what this did is it meant many, many, many thousands of people stayed in their homes or stayed on their farms that otherwise would have gotten into a trouble. In this context, one of the things that the realization emerged is that we could, as a result of this, help to arrest the decline and begin to just stabilize the systems that we were in. But then the United States and Canada and other places went off to war and participated in a global conflict, and scaled up industries and scaled up the deployment of soldiers overseas. And there was a recognition that really around the time of D-Day, from that point onwards, there was an understanding that the Allied forces were likely to win. The question was, what is the likelihood that this will happen in the next 6 months or the next 8 months or the next 12? But out of this, one of the things that the economists within the White House were recognizing is that if the war ends suddenly, there will be ushered in the greatest period of unemployment and industrial dislocation which any economy has ever faced, which would, simply put, bring the United States back into the situation that it had just come out of. Continued decline because of the fact of you have an overabundance of labor, you have a scarcity of capital as all of the machine shops stop building arms and manufacturing tanks. And in this context, what could prevent it from sliding back into depression again? And the answer was, we're going to use the tools that we use to arrest the decline. We're going to use those tools instead to basically open up new opportunities to grow our economy, through house building, to make it easier. Having previously done this, to make it easier for more people to borrow more money, to pay more for housing, and to do so by allowing the lending terms to increase, by opening up land with the assurances of services, as well as the deterrence of alternatives, and by allowing more highway spending that was now unlinked from local budgets. And these components, and there's more to the story here, but these are the components where you can see that the trap was beginning to be set, because the tool that was identified to arrest decline could also be purposed to grow an economy, to juice an economy, to make it very successful. And the United States proved after the war years that it did not go into decline, but instead grew significantly and rapidly, in part because of the capacity that we had enabled to make it easier for more people to borrow more money to pay more for housing. And you could say on that first point, of course, we want more people to be able to participate in owning their own homes. But the consequence of this is we can see the impacts that this has had on rental availability, on this shift of the home ownership society, which often has a lot of really laudable things to it, but also limited many other people's potential, other people's opportunities to rent something that would suit them, for landowners to know that there was always going to be a stable market for this. But also you can see the escalation of costs beginning to be built into the system. By allowing people to borrow more, they could then pay more for housing. But all that does, if you're providing more housing, is for a time, you're going to be able to see prices stay stable. But as you begin to constrict the supply of that housing, as people have more capacity to pay more for it, your prices are just going to lock in and get higher and higher and higher. And this is something that's core to what we're seeing in our communities. And so Leventon, New York, an example of building out sort of repeats, replicas of itself over and over and over again. And this was an incredible and exceptional growth machine. It put thousands and thousands and thousands of people to work. It provided tons and tons and tons of great opportunities, building entire neighborhoods all out, all at once to a finished state. We can see an example of this in Fresno, California, for example, long ways away from where you all are, but really the pattern in many ways repeats itself even in most of your suburban communities in Massachusetts, many of the places that you'd be able to identify an analog to this in your community. We just share Fresno because we have a good map of it. But this is our annexation history. So 1897, you can see the cities beginning to develop, beginning to emerge. The 1920s, even right through the Depression, there's still some neighborhood development occurring, but much of that activity is happening within the city core as the city is thickening up, as the city is maturing. If you were to walk through downtown Fresno in 1934, you would see a couple of multi-story buildings. You would see a growing concentration of opportunity and activity, especially in that core area, as some of those first buildings that were constructed in the 1890s now are being torn down and rebuilt in more substantial form in order to continue to harvest the growing prosperity being created in the community. And think also from a public infrastructure perspective, you are adding to your base of people that are participants in this without substantially increasing the base of obligations that you have to maintain: the roads, the pipes, the sewers, all of those types of things. 1946, even through the war years, we're seeing new housing developments being created. But then following this, we begin to see sudden rapid expansion outwards, continuing to broaden outwards without the necessary thickening up of the existing cores, the places where that work should be occurring. And as a result, you see the disinvestment from your core as it now radiates out to the outskirts. And think of all of the obligations, all of the expectations of service being provided out to the furthest flung corners at the same tax rate that you're paying within your core communities, and you're beginning to see what's taking place within these spaces. And so it goes up to 2010, and we see that rapid outward expansion without the necessary vertical thickening up and the provision of more opportunities within the existing neighborhoods that were constructed there. What does this look like for the municipal indebtedness or the challenges that we face in our communities? Kansas City, 1910, 82,000 population. By 2010, it's up to 145,000. And you say, okay, that's a healthy increase in population, or we expect our cities to grow. We expect people to find homes and businesses and opportunities in our places. But then the corresponding obligation to the community to prepare and provide for the people to be able to live their lives in a dignified way increased by 27 times. So you have a modest increase in people that can pay for stuff, but you have a massive increase in the amount of stuff that needs to be paid for. This is something that resonates with a much larger audience because they can often see this in their own lives. They can see this in their own neighborhoods. They can see this in the types of things that our cities continue to have to pay for up front and yet struggle to actually find the money for it. This is why you see new development occurring at the outskirts of communities, and there might be a new community center or a new school that's put up there, and yet we're closing libraries, we're closing schools, we're closing the things that are necessary in order to allow existing neighborhoods to become stronger and more vibrant and more resilient over time. South Bend, Indiana actually experienced a negative population or a decline in population from 1960 to 2020. And yet the number of lift stations and the obligations they took on for themselves massively increased because they had changed the development pattern. They changed the way in which they expected the development to occur within their communities. And this has had a massive consequence for them and is continuing to hamper their ability. And so out of this, one of the things that we can see is that initially, much of the activity of building communities was paid for from cash reserves. You would reserve the funds necessary for this to occur. You would set that aside. You would be cautious and judicious with this. But over time, that money began to run out. And so then it was turning to bonds and turning to outside grants and turning to begging before state legislatures. How many of your city leaders have gone to the state legislators say, we need more money. We don't have any money. We don't have the ability to raise money. Well, part of the inability to raise money is when you have a very dispersed population pattern, it actually generates so many obligations that you have wittingly, knowingly said, we will continue to provide service even in a way that is very inefficient. And as a result, the consequences are growing insolvency in more and more of our communities. I chatted with a builder from Wisconsin who is retired now, and he said, look, Norm, we have lost sight of what it takes to build lasting prosperity in our communities. He said, I used to build for municipalities, and I would build very modest, careful structures. If the sewage plant needed something, I would build a tiny little outshed or things like that. Now, my son, who runs my business, simply waits for the next bond or the next federal grant to be granted. And then we build these supersized projects that are certainly going to help, but actually we lack the capacity to cover the cost for these things over the long term. And so what have we done? We have traded a robust incremental approach for a much more complicated and fragile pattern of suburban style development. One of the questions that we ask, and I would encourage, I'll drop a link to this article in our the chat as well, but is your place a good party is one of the questions that we ask. And this is really at the heart of why a lot of the objections to new housing are actually emerging out of like that South Bend or the Kansas City examples, is people are saying, how can we add anyone else to what we have if what we have is already really strained? And think of a party. If you host a party in your community and 4 of your friends come over and everybody brings something, and then more people keep showing up, but they're not contributing to that party, then that's not a good party. And in the context of the suburban pattern of development, oftentimes this looks like there's no new roads being added, there's no new schools being added, there's no new parks being added. So everything in the way that it was first built is expected to simply cover the cost or the needs of the people that live there. But then it asks the question, why would you ever add anyone more if nothing new is being added because of the introduction of new people? And a lot of people deep down feel this sense. They're like, hey, it's not a good party if no one that is coming in is actually adding to the situation that we find ourselves in. But a good party is when as more people come in, more things are added to the community, more things are allowed to be developed. And we see this in the traditional development pattern. There would be an initial injection of private investment. Oftentimes this looked like building a train stop or platting out the town, identifying some core structure and then saying, all right, this place is now available. We're going to start to build homes. We're going to start to build storefronts. You would see the introduction of more and more private investment. And following that would be covenanted or sort of public investment, things that people would say in common, we will do together. Then as you continue to do those things, you continue to add capacity to the community, then you build more and you continue to build, but private investment would lead the way and public investment would follow. The suburban pattern is very different. It is to first say, we're going to build out the highway interchange, the utilities. We're going to construct the frontage roads. We're expanding the water treatment system. We anticipate 50 years of demand. So we're going to overbuild our water treatment plant and all of the other facilities. We're going to do all of that. And then we're going to wait for everything else to build in. And we see this all over the place, and it's damaged our communities. It's deeply broken the operating systems of our communities. The Walmart gets built, perhaps you get the fast food, then the housing subdivision that goes in. Then all of a sudden, by that time, the Walmart is moving on to greener pastures. And over time, the ability that the existing residents have to recoup that massive upfront investment continues to decline. And so we see that contrast between the patterns of the way in which we make use of private investment versus the way that oftentimes it's intended in the suburban pattern to follow a lot of that suburban, the public investment is what we describe as a Ponzi scheme, something that is by nature designed to help those that are in early, but then creates a situation where many people try to basically milk that situation and close their eyes to the idea that in time, you're going to have to pay out. You're going to have to pay up for the promises that you made up front. And when you do this, many people are going to be left holding the bill. Now, I mentioned a couple of times, what is the suburban experiment? The suburban experiment is a radical departure from the traditional development pattern. We liken this to a massive bet. And it's the idea that we can build out entire neighborhoods all at once to a finished state. And as strong towns, we say what we are committing to, especially we can see this in our zoning bylaws. We can see this in the standards that we create. You see this in the HOA covenants that are established. It's the assumption that our neighborhoods are going to stay in a state of perpetual adolescence. We're letting them be as they are instead of allowing them to grow, to thicken up, to mature over time. My brother-in-law in Winnipeg wrote a great blog post talking about his neighborhood as a neighborhood full of illegals. Because he said, my neighborhood was built as a streetcar suburb, and as a neighborhood full of illegals, he's saying what it was is that you would see there's in his neighborhood, you see apartments, you see accessory dwelling units, you see little cottage courts, you see all of this sort of mix of different housing types. There's single family homes, there's duplexes, triplexes, and again, these little apartments populated throughout. And then the city of Winnipeg in 1960 downzoned everything to single family housing, so that would preserve a state of perpetual adolescence for all of their ring neighborhoods. What does this do? It strangles it. Think of that duck that has the little plastic ring for the soda cans around its neck. That's what you have done to our entire neighborhoods. And then you cap the capacity of our communities. And because we've done this since the 1960s, we're now in the state where the consequences of this have become so plain. And so this is one of those things that as we begin to navigate the ways in which we communicate with people that we're advocating to or advocating with, elements of it is to say, you need to understand the longer story here. This is not the story of the triumph of the preference for the single family home. This is the triumph of the obligation for the single family home to be the only thing that was made available. In my city, that's 85% of our housing land is set aside for single family homes. And yet the thing that we need the least of at this time, the thing that costs $1.3 million, is still the thing that is easiest to build in our community, while everything else is a whole lot of heartache, a whole lot of pain, a whole lot of barriers, and a whole lot of trouble, even with your neighbors, until just recently when we removed some of the need to consult neighbors in order to bring about a change. Because you can see this is in Delta, BC. There's now a housing development in behind it, but otherwise this is still from the 1970s, what that neighborhood looks like today, except the trees have grown a little bit. And yet we've lost the ability for this to rapidly iterate. Now, this is a little bit wonky, but let me talk through what it looks like for cities and why they were incentivized to do this, and why we talk about this as a Ponzi scheme. In those opening years, as you see new neighborhoods being built all at once to a finished state, you say, wow, this is amazing. As each year we get the property taxes, each year we have all of the things that are coming in, we have new residents, growth is good. But at year 25, say, the pipes come due. They need to be repaired. So any cash that has come in, much of that is going to be required in order to cover the costs, especially with inflationary increases in construction costs, is going to be necessary in order to cover the costs for that reconstruction. And so if you do multiple projects, you can head that off a little bit by allowing more projects to be in the pipeline. You basically say each year we're bringing in more permit fees, we're bringing in more opportunities, and this all feels like a really healthy growth machine. It's a machine that just continues to spin up new cash. And when I worked in the mayor's office in the city of Surrey, we were the fastest growing city in the province of British Columbia, one of the fastest in North America. And as a result, we had lots of new things. There was so much money in the cookie jar. The trouble is that now, as those projects have now come due or are going to come due, basically we were in a situation where we were trying to ramp up, continue to build more and more, but the amount of money that we had set aside was never sufficient for the costs that are going to come due. And this is what we're seeing in more and more of our places that are becoming insolvent. And the cost of that existing housing is one of those things that people often struggle to understand. That those first, say, 29 years or up to, say, year 35, in that first 35 years, much of the actual cost of you living in your home was covered by other people. And so people can say, well, I lived here. Why should I have to pay for new development that's occurring, that's putting strain on our pipes or putting trouble on our roads? And we face this all the time. Perhaps you face this as well. And the truth is, you as a homeowner have been stressing those pipes. You as a homeowner have been driving those roads for much longer than the new entrant ever has. Therefore, the degraded state of that pipe, the degraded state of that road is actually a consequence of your use, not their entrance. And yet, you didn't pay the cost. You had low taxes. You had user fees that were kept very low in good years, and it results in inadequate reserves. So that now, one of the things that perhaps you have this in Massachusetts as well, much of the obligation for the costs of repairing existing infrastructure is front loaded on new development, which drives up the cost of social housing, drives up the cost of so many different types of duplex conversions, triplex conversions. You want to start a housing co-op. Good luck covering the cost of whatever your bill of public infrastructure is going to be, even though it's not something that you, as the new entrant into the system, actually caused. You had nothing to do with it, and yet you have to pay for it. That's the opposite, or that is why we call this a growth Ponzi scheme. That the growth Ponzi scheme entrant, when you're late in the game, you're putting a lot of money in, and you're going to get very little out, if anything, or most of the time you're just stuck left holding the bill. And so traditional development patterns are really are centered on the idea that we need assemblies of increasingly independent neighborhoods that gradually have the capacity to thicken up, to mature, to grow vertically as well as to grow horizontally, but also to create more opportunities for more entrants to participate in this process. We call this fine-grained urbanism as a necessary precursor to really healthy communities. And it results in incremental responses to local pressure that capitalizes on proximity. This is my little village core. And you can see how even when you had acres and acres and acres of available land, the decisions and the choices always moved towards, let's make sure we're together. Let's make sure we're together, not because we love each other. I'm sure they didn't always, but because that's how you build prosperity. You capitalize on proximity together. You can see this in this is the original city plat for the community that I'm in. And you can see the concentration of activity and prosperity building opportunities that occurred. And with this, there's an ongoing adaptation to local pressure that is so necessary in our spaces. And so complex systems, contrasted complicated sort of machine-like systems versus complex systems have means of correction that bring you up and down through the equilibrium zone with calibrated frequency. In contrast, the suburban experiment deliberately says we want nothing to do with bounces. We want nothing to do with sort of iterative change. Instead, we're resistant to change. We'll exclude by class, because class is often a proxy for resistance to change of various kinds, as well as mandatory car ownership. And again, not all of these assumptions were done from a deeply, twisted perspective. Sometimes they were done with good intentions, but often with perverse outcomes. And this is the context that we find ourselves in, that even many of these standards of resistance to change, exclusion by class, and mandatory car ownership were smuggled into our cities, as I said at the outset. And so we've traded a robust incremental approach for a complicated and fragile pattern of development. With expectations very high for the places that we build, with a demand of low taxes and equal services. I'm going to move through I'm going to move through this just because I'm mindful of my time at 36 minutes already. So one of the things that we point this out, and if you're interested in the question of the financial performance of our places, I would definitely encourage you that this is one of the areas where we find we can connect with a lot of suits. We can connect with a lot of unlikely allies on the question of what happens when we lose sight of what it takes to build lasting prosperity. This is an example of the IHOP in Santa Barbara. Actually, no, I will go back. I'll do this very briefly. So this is just a lot by lot comparison of the relative performance of each of these different sites within the city of Santa Barbara. I was there just recently, and so I'm sharing these results with you. And on a per acre basis, that is comparing things on a like manner. One of the things that you can see with this small little restaurant is that it's valued at $25.3 million per acre on a 0.1 acre site, which you can extrapolate and say, if we were to develop roughly at this level of intensity, notice a two-story structure. If we develop at this level of intensity, we'll enjoy a $25.3 million per acre of stored value, from which a portion of that is used in order to provide for the public good, for the common good. In this case, $287,000 an acre in annual property taxes coming to the city and coming to the community. But even that's actually that's a lower amount than in many other places that allow for more property taxes to be taken from properties. But even there, $287,000 an acre coming in. A slightly larger site here, just around the block, only a one-story building, still holding its value at $22.6 million per acre. A 0.05 acre site, $43.5 million per acre. And again, this is just a very simple structure. And yet here it is performing well within the community, radiating and building wealth within that place. And interestingly, because of its small scale, it's only, I mean, only a $2 million property. This is something that can be purchased by lots of different entrepreneurs within the community. They can make a go of it. They can figure out what to do with it. There's opportunities and options here. And I compared that with their Macy's, the gleaming jewel of the suburban standard, the big suburban mall. And in this context, this site comes in at $4.4 million an acre. Notice that is a massive drop off in value. That's a massive drop off in stored wealth. And we've done it to ourselves by turning up our noses at this and declaring our preference for this. But you can prefer the thing that doesn't work for you, but it may not be a good idea to have it. And this is something that we need to make really clear. And this is the IHOP as well, where you change that development pattern, 0.72 acre site, and its value per acre drops. And you can see this from above, that rather than if you take those downtown streetscapes where you saw all of the buildings cheek by jowl next to each other because they're concentrating in order to build wealth together. And in contrast, when you begin to disperse that, when you begin to sort of distort that by having parking right on the street, convenient, but very devastating for the capacity of that property to actually create enough value. Out of this, that change in development pattern creates this lack, this absence, this gap in what we have available to us. But then let's pivot. Let's touch on the way in which we simultaneously changed our development pattern, but then also began to see a run up in prices by introducing scarcity by limiting the ability of our neighborhoods to be adapted over time. These are the house prices from the 1960s all the way up until the 2020s. You can see how there was always sort of a marginal increase in cost, and this is adjusted for inflation. So this is dollar by dollar the same. And in this context, this is the Case-Shiller index, if you're curious. One of the things that I said earlier was that complex systems have means of correction that allow you to go up and down through the equilibrium zone with quite a bit of frequency. And in that context, what you would expect to see is spikes and then troughs all the way along as we go along. But that backstopping of federal mortgages, the continued enshrining and establishing by zoning standards of certain types of neighborhoods being the only thing that can be constructed in vast swaths of our land, as well as the assumptions of auto dependency and the ways in which that has scattered the types of options that we would have available, making things like Tempe or cul-de-sac in Tempe, Arizona, a community built without the need for anyone to have a car as the exception rather than the norm in our cities. These are the types of things that have then contributed to a run-up in the cost of our housing. When housing is shelter, all housing types are needed and actually welcomed in rapid or fluid response to local need. Think of the times where rapidly we have seen our communities actually be able to say, hey, we need to rapidly provide housing in this place. That might look like a FEMA trailer. That might look like a tiny home village. That might look like a flurry of rapid housing construction. And you can actually do that. Housing Habitat for Humanity can build houses in just a couple of weeks when we put our minds and our hearts to it. And in this context, when we say housing is shelter, we need to allow this. Change then increases opportunities. But when housing is treated as an investment, and this is a key part of our whole juicing the economy, is recognizing that housing became a very predictable form of making a lot of money. You want predictable financial units that are predicated on persistent scarcity to manage and maximize value, which results in a fact that change threatens the bottom line. And so if this is the situation that we're in, back in 2004, upwards to 2008, we see a run-up. We called that the housing bubble. Then there was the crash. And then that phrase that everybody likes to throw around, that we're in the midst of the recovery. The recovering from 2008. Well, we have long since eclipsed that point. And I wondered, I had hopes as a renter that the whole thing would crash in 2022 so I could finally buy a home, but it didn't happen because there was no correction there. And this is by design, and this is the struggle that we're dealing with and why we need to opt out of many of the standard sort of systems for accumulating wealth by means of housing, because it's often the case that individuals are the renters and the poor are the only ones that are not benefiting from high house prices. This is the odds being stacked, and yet the challenge that we face is that the renters and the poor are growing. That class of individuals in that situation is continuing to increase. I always joke somewhat seriously that they're also finding pitchforks. I think this is part of our growing sort of social instability that we're experiencing in a lot of our communities. And this is creating severe divides between people, as well as limiting people's capacity for what lies ahead. Because as just one example, the starter house is nearly extinct. That is the house that can be purchased on a very basic income is virtually extinct. The red line shows homes that are available for less than $200,000 across the U.S. And I would imagine that as we update this chart, that there would be the numbers would be even more stark as we look at them. And so how do we respond? What are some of the areas to keep pressing at, as you are and as other advocates are working with you on this? At one level, you need to be assured you're doing many of the right things. To reform zoning laws is absolutely essential. That is the plastic ring that is strangled, that has been preventing the growth of, well, it's a bit of a macabre image, but, for that, say you get a small little duck and that duck gets the ring around its neck. The only thing it can do to stay alive is not grow. The only thing it can do is just retain its existing form. But the more that you begin to add to that duck, the more threatening it is to itself. And this is the situation that we find ourselves in, that as pressure increases, we have created the conditions for a really horrible setup for so many in our communities. And so we need to increase the supply of entry-level housing. Let's talk about that. An element of it is just that work of reforming zoning laws is so necessary. Taking a look, even in many of our communities, we can identify places where there are still gaps. My community doesn't look like this. We don't have as many gaps, but they still exist. And the question is it just the case that the same thing is going to be built on these sites, or can we begin to see the addition of new housing? This is where rules for allowing more cottage courts or cottages rather, backyard cottages to be constructed is so essential. And I applaud the actions being taken at the state level in your state, as well as in my province, where this is beginning to happen. But you can see how much potential without it having to do what Kansas City and South Bend did, without having to expand all that much of your core infrastructure, you can add significantly more housing. And if you work together with your local resident or local officials to be able to reform not only the zoning laws, but also the transportation assumptions about how people maneuver through your community, you begin to unlock the capacity for so much in your community. Our friends at Urban 3 helped us with this slide where they compared two types of neighborhoods, for example. And yet, so the Horseshoe Trace as well as Georgian Courts, a 3-acre site. You can see an example of what it looks like. So it's not a compact, or what do people complain about? I don't want to live in a shoebox. That's not a shoebox. That is a good home. In that context, you could fit 2,600 of those parcel sizes into the Horseshoe Trace if you were to use the same size of lots for the Georgian Courts as you were in the Horseshoe Trace. What is the consequence of doing that? Even though currently in most of our zoning bylaws, this would be extremely difficult, if not impossible, to be able to do it. In that context, you would see its current value, Horseshoe Trace, that area over here that the city is generating property taxes from, that people are storing wealth in, is storing a total capacity of $29.7 million in total taxable value. But if you were to allow for and then see the redevelopment of those sites into something even closely resembling the Georgian Court style, Georgian Court buildings filling the area of Horseshoe Trace, it would be up to 14 times its current value. So that there is money on the table that we are obsequiously deciding not to make use of, not to allow, by continuing to enshrine much of the protections that we exist for existing neighborhoods. And so this is something where we would say there is a financial life or death situation unfolding here, and yet many of our standards assume that this is the default and this is the exception, that this is the curiosity and this is the norm. And we need to revert back to an understanding that this is what healthy cities look like, things that actually carry the capacity to not only house people as shelter, but also provide a good life and a prospering place with the capacity for our communities to be able to cover the costs that we have. We're so insistent on this. And I'll share that we have found that this is one of the ways that we can connect with individuals that otherwise would look askance at it. People that would say, hey, I just like living on a large lot with a big home. And you say, yes, but what is the long-term consequences of having this? And are you willing to actually pay the true cost of doing so? And oftentimes when you begin to express it in that way, you say, if we keep your neighborhood in perpetual adolescence, we've even proposed neighborhoods should be able to vote together. If we want to be exempted from state upzoning, we should be allowed to do that. But then there should be a corresponding sort of escalator in the amount of taxes that are going to be ascribed to that parcel or that area or that community. So that if an entire HOA says, we're going to be a change-free zone, say you can be, but we're now applying a different taxing formula because you are not participating in processes that actually add to the party. Instead, you're saying, no, we're going to be one of those bad parties where nobody new ever comes in and nobody brings anything new. And as a result, we're going to just pay a pittance. And so we've said, if you want to be Horseshoe Trace, you can do so. And unsurprisingly, people are willing to take us up on that. But this is something that we would say. Another key element of it is we have to re-normalize small housing should not be the exception, especially homes that are 800 square feet or thereabouts. That was normal. I grew up in a small little farmhouse that the CP Rail had built for its employees along the tracks as they were constructing them, and they would give land allotments to people. That house was 800 square feet for a family of 7. That was normal. And we actually often will ask, like, how many of you would like to live in a house that's 500 square feet? Not a lot of people put up their hands. We'll ask how many of you have lived in a house that was 500 square feet or less, and most will. They remember in a dorm setting. They remember in starting out. Lots of people have lived in very small spaces. And this is the type of housing that the main market is not providing, except for in rare circumstances where they're building micro suites. But this is the building block or the ladder of prosperity. And in so many of our places, we've taken those that bottom rung off. And so out of this, maybe one of the takeaways I would encourage for you is where do we see aversions to complex adaptation and how can we remove them? This is an image from my hometown in Lethbridge, Alberta, where just in the way that this site has been laid out, the way in which the buildings have been separated from each other, the way in which all of the street frontage looks exactly the same as if it was a single family neighborhood development. The result of this is that it is difficult, if not impossible, for this site to be improved, for this site to see more housing added without really disrupting sort of the pattern of the way that things are established. We see this, that even in a brand new residential area where you know that hundreds and hundreds of people are going to be living, children are going to be present, we still see wide roads, we still see sweeping curves that increase speed, we still see that none of the other elements of what it takes to build a healthy neighborhood have been considered. And it won't be a surprise to you that this is rental rather than home ownership. This is what we do when we so often foist on others the things that we want to see. The suburban experiment, as I said, is marked by resistance to change, exclusion by class, and mandatory car ownership. And even this building then, oftentimes by its zoning, is left in a state of perpetual adolescence for probably longer than it would otherwise be if the property owners were guided to say, when there is new need, you have free reign to be able to construct additional dwelling units there. You have the capacity to add a 4th story or 5th story. You have the capacity, if your building allows for it to be adapted to include residential and retail, to be able to do those types of things that are the complex adaptations that are necessary. For the bottom floor of that first unit there to be turned into a small restaurant, provided that safety standards are met, yet most of our standards don't allow for anything like this. And this is going to be the challenge. We need to legalize our next increment by right. We say you should have a minimum amount of regulatory friction to increase in housing density. That is, if you come in, you want to build a duplex on a house or a lot that previously had a single occupant home on it, you should be able to walk in at 9 o'clock with a 9th grade education and leave by noon with the permits to do so. That's a far cry from the standards that we have, but all that we are doing is adding what already exists, just that one increment of intensity more. That's not rocket science. It shouldn't be this difficult, and we need to make it easier for this to happen. And so we've also proposed for cities, if they get a little nervous, to do away with their official zoning process and all of the change of use processes and things like that. Say either you allow people to build to the next increment, or for builders that say, well, I actually want to build, a 6-story tower or a 6-story building here, give them the permission to go through the whole rigmarole. Give them the permission to still have that track available to them if they want to skip increments. But the vast majority of the activity can actually take place amongst those that are just moving on to the next increment, allowing their community to thicken up as it grows. Tied into this, statewide, citywide, countrywide, we need to eliminate parking minimums. One way to explain this is that there is always going to be a market requirement for parking, but that market requirement is understood best by property owners, is understood best by them when they want to market a new housing unit that they've built, or they want to adapt a structure that they have themselves. And it might shift, it might change, it ebbs and flows, even site by site, depending on when the bus stops are put in and where the mass transit systems are established. And in this context, municipally imposed requirements do a woeful job of actually addressing parking and drive up costs for everyone. And so this is something that we are pressing on in so many ways. I'm at 54 minutes, so I'm going to move through just a couple more items, and then we're going to wrap up here in the presentation and go to questions. But we need to match our transportation goals with housing goals. I love again, my brother-in-law wrote a piece, and he said, road and road expansions, we know that they encourage greenfield development. So whenever we continue to invest, that's often the language, we invest in our transportation system to enable new development. What if we invest in different types of transportation? Will we then see other types of development begin to emerge? This is where, if we say we're going to cut the budget for road expansions, or we're going to, at Strongtown, so we say no new roads are necessary. What, to a certain extent, as a thought experiment, if we said no new roads, what would that do to our whole mindset? Well, for one, it would stop the outward sprawl, wouldn't it? But it would also begin to ask us questions. What can we do with our existing roadways? What can we do with our existing streets? How do we make those streets platforms for building wealth? How do we do that? Oftentimes it requires that we slow the cars, or that we actually pivot our mindset. And Massachusetts is beginning to really pick up on this, even at the state level, is we need to build places for people that can accommodate cars, can accommodate delivery trucks, can accommodate fire service vehicles and things like this. But the opposite of building places that really are for cars and then accommodate people is exactly the wrong way to do this. And so this is a key part of it. So transportation, as much as you push on housing, has to be met with transportation initiatives as well. Normalizing lending for ADUs, or accessory dwelling units, is critical here. We're seeing this as in the state of in California, simply by making more things available for people to be able to borrow. You can get a car loan often easier than you can to get a backyard cottage loan, even though your prices sometimes are going to be pretty comparable, because of the assumption that there's such a risk in building housing, even though that housing does not crash. Well, it can crash in a market sense, but doesn't crash into things, doesn't get destroyed by wildfires, except in LA, I suppose, does have the situation that we see, that there's this stored value in a house that builds, rather than our vehicles and other things that we make loans available for, that people just use in a much more casual way. Forgive me, I didn't mean to make light of the LA fires. My mind went to the fact that I was using 2 senses of burning down. Removing minimum lot sizes is necessary. This is one of those throwbacks. We see this especially in the state of Connecticut, where they weaponized lot sizes in order to be able to drive up the input price or the entry cost. They knowingly said we can have 3/4 acre lots as the minimum, because then we only get people with sufficient means to be able to come into our communities. We instead know that we need to remove the minimum lot sizes because they serve no useful purpose, and they have been used as a tool and weaponized as a tool in so many different ways. Another key thing, I work in our region, I'm mindful of how many projects have been put on pause right now, large projects, thousands of residential units comprising these, I think about 28 projects have been put on hold. They've all been put on hold by their large scale developers because of the fact that interest rates have marginally gone up and now are marginally starting to come down. And so they're on hold until basically the core economic scarcity indicators are going to improve. In this context, they are an unreliable source of new housing. They are necessary. We should seek for more towers and more construction to occur. But oftentimes the well-funded, over-capitalized, large-scale developers actually have all the means at their disposal to be able to build it, but they're waiting for the more optimal time for that to occur. And when is that optimal time to occur? When costs are higher, when prices are higher for the purchaser of those units. And so that is their game, that is their margin. Where we then say is the only way that we are going to see these changes is by also cultivating a whole new ecosystem of local developers. People that do so, yes, for funds, yes, to be able to stay in business, but also to be able to drive a new ecosystem where you make projects that just make sense, even if they don't make top dollar. Even if your return to shareholders is less because it's to you and your father-in-law and the guy down the street that's willing to invest in what you're doing. Very different than year over year performance on the stock market, where the assumption is 8%, 12%, 15% returns. In those contexts, those large scale project developers are not moving forward, and they can afford to sit on land. They can afford to do many of the things that the local little developers don't do, would never even consider doing, even if it means that the local small scale developer says, hey, my profit margin went down just a bit, but I still got out enough that I can do my next project. And so this is where the Incremental Development Alliance is a massive ally in this, and is so necessary. They will come to your town, work with your community leaders, identify local small-scale developers or developers, would-be developers in your community, help them and equip them, take them through sort of a cohort process. And it's incredible to see the types of projects and work that they are doing. We also need to lower the bar of entry for our commercial and retail opportunities in our communities. I'm going to move through this rapidly, but Muskegon, Michigan built these little chalets on a city-owned parking lot, and they rent them for, I think, $800 a year to small entrepreneurs in the community. And they say, see if your business will be a go. Because they had large retail in their downtown that was never getting rented. The landlords were needing a certain amount to be returned in rent. They were never able to find tenants that could do it. Now, with these little businesses here as incubators, they were able to fill the vast majority of the retail spaces in their downtown and fill all of these things. And this is part of that dynamic, the complex adaptation of what it takes in order to allow for new opportunities to emerge. Removing guesswork, again, you're working at this, but pre-approved building plans are a key part of this. Removing that guesswork, saying yes to new housing before anyone even asks to build it. Reducing, this is a whole other talk, but discretionary reviews with as of right approvals. This is one of the areas where we are working really hard on projects that say you should not have to go and negotiate with your city. Your city should be able to tell you this is the standard. If you meet it, and you move on. Instead, we have a lot of cities that, with the best of intentions, want to provide a customer service mindset to developers, but all that they are doing is bogging down that process, creating massive amounts of wasted time or time that is not well used, and as a consequence, continue to increase costs and drive projects arising out of an aversion to complex adaptation. We need to fund many small bets, contractor training, pre-development technical assistance, reducing land price based on affordability. There's so many different layers that are capable here. And we need to think of housing reform as a series of parallel deadbolts on a heavy door, like a bank safe. Unlocking any one lock doesn't allow the door to open, but when they're all unlocked, it's when things can proceed. And so one of those deadbolts is labeled single-family zoning, but others have different names. Built form regulations. You probably won't find too many NIMBYs rather that want to fight on built form regulations. So find ways to change those. Development fees, finding ways to actually negotiate and work with cities and municipalities on this. Development delays. NIMBYs don't have as much to do with that as we often think that they do. Access to financing, cost of construction, skilled labor shortage is a major need. Development culture and support networks. And these are all areas that we can work on together. And so with that, I know that we are in the midst of a serious crisis. We have many, many serious and heartfelt people working to change this. And I'm so grateful for you taking the time this morning or afternoon now in your part of the world to be able to touch on this. And I want to go through any of the questions that you have, or maybe some of the complaints or rebuttals that you want to offer. And I will also drop in the chat, just again, the resource page that we created related to this talk, where the slides will be posted afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Norman. If folks just want to raise their hands with questions, Norm, I'll let you call on folks directly, or I can handle it if you don't see the hands.
I see a question in the chat about restricting short-term rentals with zoning reform. This is one of those areas where we have tools that are so powerful. So the algorithms or the matching tools of the short-term rental sort of systems are so powerful that they create these rapid sort of accelerants of cost and price and things like this. And this is where at Strong Towns we're cautious around the idea that like you should just get rid of a type of housing. Short-term rentals are a type of housing. They have a place, but they can create sort of perverse incentives for people to take housing out of the long-term rental market and turn it into short-term rentals. Or you see we were down in Florida for an event, and you see entire neighborhoods that have been built out as vacation rentals, as short-term rentals. And there's something very perverse because they were not in walkable neighborhoods. There was no sense that they've been integrated into any of the places. It was a rather lifeless sort of place to be in. And this is something that we definitely want to address in the context of how do we identify, one, I think the element of local ownership. So the city of Brainerd, or town of Brainerd, sorry, Chuck Marone, who's our founder, he was involved in helping their project where they said ownership needs to be within, I think, a couple of blocks of the property. So it doesn't have to be owner occupied, which is one of the proposals. And I've seen that being proposed for a lot of like tourist dependent communities or things like this. But do you have to be in the community? Does that provide enough friction to stop sort of the endless acquisition of targeted vacation properties in order to then be able to say, if there's going to be sort of the harvesting of tourist dollars, it should still in some way be funneling into the local ecosystem instead of being extracted out. In more mature cities, there's often a recognition that a lot of that need is just a consequence of a deep, deep, deep imbalance in the rental market. The scarcity of available options creates the short-term incentive for short-term rentals to become commonplace. Think even of back in the day, it would have been very common for someone to get a 1 month, 2 month, 3 month rental as a travel nurse. Now they just go on Airbnb. There's a very simple, frictionless system to be able to do that. And it fosters a continued sort of system where that is happening. But the one element that we do insist on is that for those that are of lower incomes, in history, throughout the centuries and the millennia, what we would see is that if you were of lesser means, you would find many different income streams, or you would have numerous income streams. And often your home would serve that function. So your home would be income producing in one way or another. Now, if you work from home, in one sense, your home is an income producing home. But if you rent a room, that becomes a revenue source to make your community more, or make your ability to stay in that place a little bit more feasible. If you share a home with other family members and you run a little retail salon or something out of it, that's income producing housing. And the suburban experiment says, no, we want so little of that. Home-based businesses, but only if you make soy candles and sell handbags, but you can't manufacture them there. You can't do all these things. And so we would say many of those small sort of steps need to be taken to allow income to be produced in our homes, out of our homes, using the spaces that we have available in order to keep us in homes. And this is something that is often expressly forbidden. Short-term rentals, Airbnb being the most prominent of them, kind of makes a mess of this, but is in its own way enough of a resemblance of that effort, of that desire to use what you have and continue to harvest that value. The difficulty is out-of-town ownership really can skew things and makes very strange systems. In Vancouver, for example, they have standards for what you're allowed to do. You have to have a license. You have to pay additional fees. That's at least a small step, but the city was almost I won't say willfully blind, but they were saying like, oh, we have no idea where they are. And so somebody in Vancouver had created like a quick algorithm to just scrape the listings and be like, here they are, here they are, here they are, here they are. Are any of these registered? And none of them were. And so cities do have to adapt and be fairly like rigorous in enforcing those regulations as they go. Michael?